I was the main act at the club that night when Vic, the owner, told the packed audience that musicians are replaceable. I smiled from the stage, knowing that in my bag were copies of our contract, the ticket sales data, and messages from every other band in town. He thought I'd play along with his exposure scam. By midnight, he'd learned exactly how irreplaceable I really was. It started 6 months earlier. I'd been playing local venues for years, building a decent following in our city's underground music scene. My band, the Downbeats, wasn't famous, but we had loyal fans and enough gigs to make a modest living. We practiced in my garage 3 times a week, perfecting our sound, a mix of jazz, funk, and indie rock that was uniquely ours. I remember the first time I met Victor Crane. It was a Tuesday evening at the Melody Bar, a small venue where we frequently played. I was packing up my guitar after a set when this well-dressed man approached me, drinkers in hand, flashing a smile that showed too many teeth. "That was quite a performance," he said, extending his hand. "Victor Crane. I own the Spotlight downtown." The Spotlight was the biggest venue in our part of the city, a renovated theatre that could hold 500 people. Playing there would be a significant step up for us. "Thanks," I replied, shaking his hand. "Marcus, lead of the Downbeats. I've heard good things about your band. Been watching you for a while, actually." He took a sip of his whiskey. "I'm looking for fresh talent for the Spotlight. Would you be interested in playing there?" My heart raced. This was exactly the kind of opportunity we'd been working toward. "Absolutely. We'd love to discuss it." "Great." He handed me his business card. "Call my office tomorrow. We'll set something up." As he walked away, I noticed how everyone's eyes followed him. Victor had that effect. He commanded attention, carried himself like someone important. I slipped his card into my pocket, already imagining our name on the Spotlight's marquee. The next day, I called and scheduled a meeting. When I arrived at the Spotlight, I was immediately impressed. The venue was beautiful. High ceilings, professional lighting system, a proper stage, and a state-of-the-art sound system. This was leagues above the bars and small clubs we usually played. Victor greeted me in his office, which overlooked the main floor. "Marcus, good to see you again. Coffee?" I accepted, and he poured me a cup from an expensive-looking machine in the corner. "So, I've been thinking about having the Downbeats headline a Friday night. We do themed nights, and I'm planning a local legends showcase. You guys would be perfect." "That sounds amazing," I said, trying to contain my excitement. "What kind of arrangement were you thinking?" Victor leaned back in his leather chair. "Well, here's the deal. The exposure from playing the Spotlight is invaluable. People who matter, come here. Label scouts, festival organizers, influencers. This could be your big break." I nodded, waiting for him to continue. "For new acts, we offer an exposure-based arrangement. You play, we promote you, and you get to keep 10% of the door after expenses." My enthusiasm dampened slightly. "What exactly are the expenses?" "Standard stuff," he waved dismissively. "Sound, lighting, staff, promotion. Don't worry about the details. My accountant handles all that. The point is, this is about building your career, not making a quick buck." Something felt off, but I didn't want to seem difficult. "Could I get that in writing? Just so the band and I are clear on the terms." "Of course." Victor smiled, that too wide smile again. "My assistant will draw up a standard contract. Nothing complicated." I left with mixed feelings. The opportunity was incredible, but Victor's vagueness about payments concerned me. Still, I convinced myself it was worth it for the exposure. When the contract arrived by email the next day, I read it carefully. It stated we'd receive 10% of ticket sales after expenses, but didn't detail what those expenses were. Against my better judgment, I signed it and returned it. The weeks leading up to the show were intense. We practiced harder than ever, refined our set list, and promoted the event everywhere we could. Victor had promised to handle marketing, but I noticed the Spotlight's social media barely mentioned us. I picked up the slack, making sure our fans knew about this milestone performance. The night of the show arrived. I stood backstage, peeking through the curtain at the growing crowd. The venue was filling up nicely. My bandmates were nervous, but excited. This was our chance to shine on a bigger stage. "Quite a turnout," Victor said, appearing beside me suddenly. He was dressed impeccably, as always, smelling of expensive cologne. "Yeah, looks like we'll have a full house," I replied, feeling proud. "Your fans are loyal. That's good." He checked his watch. "You're on in 20. Break a leg." Our performance that night was electric. The sound system made us sound better than ever, and the crowd's energy was incredible. We played our hearts out, and the response was overwhelming. Standing ovations, encore requests. It was everything we'd hoped for, and more. After the show, I was riding high on adrenaline and validation. Fans lined up to buy our merchandise and tell us how much they loved the performance. Several people mentioned they'd never heard of us before, but were now devoted fans. This was exactly the kind of exposure Victor had promised. A week passed, then 2. I hadn't heard anything from Victor about payment. I called the Spotlight's office several times, but the receptionist always said he was in meetings or out of the office. Finally, after 3 weeks, I received an email. Dear Marcus, attached is the financial breakdown for your performance. After expenses, your 10% share amounts to $43.27. Please find the enclosed check. We look forward to potentially working together again. Regards, Victor Crane. I stared at the email in disbelief. $43.27? For a show that had at least 400 people paying $20 each at the door? That would mean expenses of nearly $8,000, which seemed absurdly high. I immediately called the Spotlight. This time, I refused to be brushed off. Victor Crane, please, I told the receptionist firmly. To my surprise, he actually took the call. Marcus, how are you? Enjoying the afterglow of your big night? Victor, I just received the payment breakdown. There must be some mistake. Mistake, he said, his tone cooling. Those are the numbers. The expenses were higher than expected. Security, sound technicians, the bartenders worked overtime, plus all the promotion we did. But we barely saw any promotion from your end. And $43 for a sold-out show? That doesn't add up. He sighed as if I was being unreasonable. Look, Marcus, this is how the business works. You got what you really needed. Exposure. I've already had people asking about you. Isn't that worth more than a few dollars? I felt my blood pressure rising, but it kept my voice steady. Could you send me an itemized list of expenses? Our contract entitles us to that. The contract you signed gives us discretion on expense allocation. But fine, I'll have my accountant send something over. Just remember, the Spotlight gave you a platform you couldn't get elsewhere. Don't be ungrateful. The call ended, and I sat there, fuming. The itemized list never came, despite my follow-up emails and calls. What really opened my eyes was running into Jamie, the lead singer of The Resonance, who had played at the Spotlight the week before us. How much did you guys make from your show? I asked him over beers at a local dive bar. Jamie laughed bitterly. $50 and change. Victor claimed expenses ate up everything else. Same story he gave us, I said. It's his whole business model, Jamie explained. He gets bands desperate for exposure to play for essentially nothing, pockets the door, and sells overpriced drinks. Been doing it for years. That conversation was a turning point. I started asking around, connecting with other local musicians who had played at the Spotlight. The pattern was clear. Victor routinely exploited bands, promising exposure while pocketing their earnings. Some had been paid nothing at all, with Victor claiming the show had actually lost money. I was angry, but I didn't want to just complain. I wanted justice, not just for my band, but for every musician Victor had exploited. I needed proof, a plan, and allies. My first step was to gather evidence. I collected testimonials from other bands who had been similarly cheated. I obtained copies of their contracts, payment statements, and communications with Victor. I also started tracking the Spotlight's events, noting the ticket prices and estimating attendance. Next, I reached out to a friend who worked as a bartender at the Spotlight. She risked her job to give me information about the actual drink sales and attendance figures for several shows, including ours. The numbers confirmed my suspicions. Victor was drastically inflating expenses and underreporting revenue. I also discovered something interesting. The Spotlight was struggling financially, despite Victor's flashy persona and apparent success. He had taken out several loans to keep the venue running and was behind on payments to vendors and even some staff. His exploitation of musicians wasn't just unethical, it was a desperate attempt to stay afloat. With this information, I approached other local bands with a proposal, a unified response to Victor's practices. To my surprise, almost everyone was on board. Even established acts who hadn't been directly affected were disgusted by Victor's behavior and wanted to support the local music community. Together, we formed the City Musicians Collective, a loose alliance committed to fair treatment and transparent payment practices. We created a shared document detailing our experiences with various venues, helping newcomers avoid exploitation. But I wasn't satisfied with just warning others about the Spotlight. I wanted Victor to face consequences for his actions. That's when an unexpected opportunity presented itself. The Spotlight was planning a massive anniversary event, 5 years in business, with a lineup of local bands culminating in a headline performance by the Downbeats. Victor had reached out, claiming our previous show had been so successful that he wanted us back as the main attraction. We'll renegotiate terms, of course, he said smoothly over the phone. I recognize your value now. How about 15% of the door? I pretended to consider it. Make it 20% and we'll talk. That's steep. But for you, I'll make an exception. This event is going to be huge. Tickets are already selling fast. I agreed to the deal, insisting on a new contract that specified 20% of gross ticket sales, not net after expenses. Victor hesitated but eventually agreed. What he didn't know was that I had no intention of letting him control the narrative this time. The weeks before the anniversary show were busy. Publicly, I promoted the event enthusiastically, encouraging our fans to buy tickets. Privately, I coordinated with the other bands on the lineup, all members of our new collective. Each had their own stories of Victor's exploitation, and each was eager for accountability. I also reached out to local music journalists, sharing our evidence of Victor's systematic exploitation of musicians. Several were interested in the story, but agreed to hold off until after the anniversary event, which would provide the perfect backdrop for exposing his practices. The night of the show arrived. The spotlight was packed, completely sold out. I had personally tracked ticket sales through our fans and contacts, confirming that at least 500 people had paid $30 each. That meant gross ticket revenue of $15,000, of which we were owed $3,000 based on our contract. Backstage was electric with tension. All the bands knew what was coming. We had coordinated our plan carefully. The first three acts performed brilliantly, warming up the crowd. Then came the fourth band, the Harmonics, whose lead singer had been particularly vocal about Victor's exploitation. As they finished their set, their frontwoman addressed the crowd. "Before we go, I want to thank Victor Crane for having us tonight. Victor, could you come out here for a moment?" Victor emerged from the wings, smiling and waving to the audience. He clearly thought this was going to be a moment of praise. "Victor has provided a platform for local musicians for 5 years now," she continued, her voice pleasant but with an edge that made Victor's smile falter slightly. "And tonight, we'd like to acknowledge his unique approach to supporting artists." Victor's expression tightened, but he maintained his composure, clearly trying to assess whether this was a genuine tribute or something else. "In fact, we've prepared a special presentation," she said, nodding to the side of the stage where a projection screen was being lowered. Panic flashed across Victor's face as the screen lit up with a spreadsheet, a detailed accounting of the Spotlight's ticket sales, actual expenses, and the pittance paid to performers over the past year. The data had been compiled from our collective's research, including information from my bartender friend and other insiders. "What is this?" Victor hissed, trying to keep his voice down as the audience murmured. "Transparency," she replied into the microphone. "Something the Spotlight has been lacking." Victor grabbed for the microphone, but she smoothly stepped away. "And now, I'd like to invite Marcus from the Downbeats to share some thoughts." That was my cue. I walked onto the stage, carrying my guitar and a folder. The crowd cheered. They were here largely for us, after all. "Thanks for that introduction," I said calmly. "And thank you all for coming tonight. Before we play, I want to share something with you." I opened the folder and pulled out several documents. These are contracts and payment statements from bands who have played at the Spotlight, including my own. They show a pattern of exploitation that has gone on for years. The audience was dead silent now. Victor stood frozen at the edge of the stage, his face contorted with rage and fear. "For our last performance here, the Downbeats were paid $43 for a sold-out show," I continued. "Tonight, we're supposed to receive 20% of ticket sales. Based on the 500 tickets sold at $30 each, that's $3,000. I turned to Victor. "Will we receive that payment tonight, Victor? Or will there mysteriously be $14,000 in expenses again?" Victor finally snapped. He stormed toward me, grabbing the microphone. "This is ridiculous. These people are spreading lies because they're not talented enough to command proper payment. Musicians are replaceable. There are 100 bands who would play here for free just for the opportunity." The audience gasped. Victor seemed to realize his mistake immediately, but it was too late. His true attitude toward musicians was now obvious to everyone. "Replaceable, are we?" I asked quietly, not needing the microphone in the silent room. "Let's test that theory." I nodded to my bandmates who had joined me on stage. "The Downbeats will not be performing tonight." There were shouts of disappointment from the crowd. "Neither will any other bands scheduled for tonight," I continued. "In fact, no member of the City Musicians Collective will ever play at the Spotlight again, as long as Victor Crane is involved." One by one, members of the other bands who had performed came back on stage, standing with us in solidarity. The impact was powerful. Nearly 20 musicians united against exploitation. "We've also prepared these," I said, as volunteers began distributing flyers to the audience. "They contain information about Victor's business practices, along with evidence. They also include details about a new concert series we're launching next month, one where musicians will be paid fairly for their work. Victor lunged for the papers, but it was futile. They were already in hundreds of hands. "You can't do this," he shouted. "This is defamation. I'll sue you all." "Everything we're sharing is documented and true," I replied calmly. "We welcome legal scrutiny of your business practices." The crowd was restless now, many looking at Victor with disgust. Some were already heading for the exits, demanding refunds. "This isn't over," Victor snarled, but his voice lacked conviction. He knew he had lost control of the situation. "You're right about that," I agreed. "This is just the beginning." With that, we left the stage. As we walked through the crowd toward the exit, people patted our backs, expressed support, and asked how they could help. Outside, local music journalists were waiting, ready to cover the story of musicians taking a stand against exploitation. The aftermath was swift and decisive. The story spread quickly through social media and local news. More musicians came forward with their experiences, creating a damning picture of Victor's business practices. The Spotlight's reputation was in tatters. Within weeks, Victor's financial problems became insurmountable. Vendors demanded payment up front, staff quit, and bands refused to play there. The final blow came when his investors pulled out, unwilling to be associated with the scandal. 3 months after our confrontation, the Spotlight closed its doors. But the story doesn't end with Victor's downfall. The City Musicians Collective, which had formed to oppose him, evolved into something more positive and enduring. We pooled our resources and connections to launch our own concert series, Fair Play, held at various venues around the city. The concept was simple: transparent contracts, fair payment, 50% of ticket sales to performers, and reasonable drink prices. We handled our own promotion, leveraging our combined fan bases. To our delight, the first event sold out completely. Over the next year, Fair Play grew from a monthly event to a weekly staple of the city's music scene. We expanded to include workshops for new musicians, covering not just performance, but also the business side of music, how to negotiate contracts, understand revenue streams, and protect themselves from exploitation. As for me, the experience transformed my approach to my career. I became not just a musician, but an advocate and organizer. The Downbeats continued to perform and record, but I also spent time mentoring younger artists and building connections with ethical venues and promoters across the region. 6 months after the Spotlight closed, I received an unexpected email from Victor. It wasn't the angry tirade I might have expected, but something more reflective. "Marcus, I've had time to think about what happened. While I still believe some of your actions were extreme, I can't deny that my business model was flawed and unfair to artists. I'm leaving the music industry, but I wanted you to know that what you built with Fair Play is impressive. It's what the Spotlight could have been if I'd focused on sustainability rather than quick profits. Good luck. Victor." I never replied, but the email gave me a sense of closure. This hadn't been about destroying Victor. It was about creating something better for all musicians in our community. A year after our confrontation at the Spotlight, we held a special anniversary edition of Fair Play. The venue was the renovated theatre that had previously been the Spotlight, now under new ownership and management committed to ethical practices. As I stood on that stage again, looking out at the packed house, I felt a profound sense of vindication and purpose. My guitar, the same one I'd played on the night of our confrontation with Victor, felt lighter in my hands, no longer weighed down by frustration and injustice. "Before we start tonight," I said to the audience, "I want to thank everyone who stood with us a year ago when we decided that musicians deserve fair treatment. What we've built together since then proves that ethical business and great music can go hand in hand." The crowd erupted in cheers. As we launched into our first song, I caught sight of a familiar face in the audience, Jamie from The Resonance, who had shared his story of exploitation with me that day in the dive bar. He raised his glass in a toast, and I nodded back, acknowledging how far we'd come. In the end, Victor had been wrong about one fundamental thing. Musicians aren't replaceable. Each brings a unique voice and perspective. What is replaceable, as we have proved, are exploitative business models and the people who perpetuate them. The music scene in our city is healthier now. New venues have opened that follow the Fair Play model of transparency and fair payment. Established venues have improved their practices to compete. Musicians are more informed about their rights and more willing to stand together when those rights are threatened. As for the Downbeats, we're doing better than ever. The publicity from our stand against Victor actually increased our following. We released an album titled Fair Play that included a track called Replaceable, a sardonic response to Victor's infamous statement. It became our most streamed song. Sometimes I think about that night at the Spotlight, when Victor declared to a packed house that musicians are replaceable. He couldn't have been more wrong. What proved replaceable was his exploitative business model, swept aside by musicians who refused to be silenced or cheated any longer. The contract I signed for our performance tonight sits in my guitar case, clear, fair, and honoured by both parties. The check we'll receive will reflect our true value, not someone else's greed. And the music we're about to play carries the power of authenticity and justice, notes ringing out in a space reclaimed for art over exploitation. This is how change happens, not all at once in a dramatic confrontation, but in the patient building that follows, in the community that forms when people stand together, in the systems that replace broken ones, in the small victories that accumulate into transformation. And it all started because one night, a club owner underestimated just how irreplaceable musicians really are.